have invited Jack Baric to come and speak, a producer for a powerful movie, Searching for a Storm, a movie about Ante Gotovina that every Croatian must see. Unfortunately, he could not make the trip, but has sent us a powerful statement and message that will be read by Andrew Dražić. Please welcome Andrew to the stage.
This is the message from Jack Baric. When I set out to make my documentary film about the war in Croatia and the case of General Gotovina, I would often be asked why I was making the film. There are many reasons, but it really comes down to two things. First, like many of the people gathered here today, I love Croatia. Some of my fondest memories in life were the summers I spent on the islands off of Zadar, where my parents were born, and so it broke my heart to see the country at war and so many of my family and friends in danger. Second, during the war, I spent time at the Croatian office in Washington, D.C. with the hope of educating the U.S. media and government about the war. There were many misconceptions, and the propaganda coming from Belgrade was so strong that it took a lot of effort to get everyone to understand that Milosevic was the aggressor and that the peoples of Croatia and Bosnia were defending their homeland. By the end of the war, it was very clear that Milosevic was the aggressor, but the UN still stubbornly treated all sides equally, and the war did not end until President Clinton aided Croatia in planning Operation Storm to defeat Milosevic and all of his thugs, like Ratko Mladic. However, when the ICTY indicted General Gotovina, it became clear that the UN was hell-bent on proving that they were not wrong in treating Croatia and Bosnia as equally guilty for the war. It was this all sides are equal premise that guided the UN's wartime policy that prevented Croatia and Bosnia from the right to properly defend themselves, and why the UN was calling Operation Storm a crime before it was even launched. On the first day of Operation Storm, the UN spokesperson in Zagreb called a press conference to say that because the Croatians were heavily shelling the hospital in Knin, the wounded and the doctors would have to evacuate. However, in an interview in my film, the Serbian doctor that ran the hospital during the war stated that he didn't recall even one shell hitting the hospital. Years later, in the guilty verdict against Gotovina and Markac, the ICTY judges claimed that the Serbs left Knin because of heavy shelling of non-military targets. But in the ICTY's own judgment papers, it states that of the 1,205 shells aimed at Knin, only 65 landed on non-military targets, 43 of which landed in an empty grass field, and no one was hurt or killed by the other 22. The UN was predisposed to indict the Croatian generals as war criminals because they knew that if their policies of treating all the combatants equally in the war and not pointing a finger at Milosevic to stop his aggression were proven to be wrong, then these policies would give the UN the guilt of hundreds of thousands of people killed and millions more displaced during the war. I believe that the UN is guilty, and the scene of their greatest guilt was in Srebrenica, where their massive failure allowed 8,000 Bosnians to be massacred by the forces under the command of Ratko Mladic. They may try Mladic at the ICTY for his crimes, but who will try the UN for their failure in stopping him? It seems plainly obvious to me that the capture of Ratko Mladic was given in exchange for the guilty verdict of Ante Gotovina. But I wonder if this little game that the UN is playing will backfire when we make it clear to the world that the UN's failures in Srebrenica would have reoccurred in the Bosnian town of Bihać, where thousands more would have been massacred by Mladic right under the nose of the UN, if Operation Storm, led by Gotovina and Markac, had not happened. Gotovina and Markac stopped Mladic's genocidal war when the UN could not, and yet they still sit in a jail cell. I call on all the political journalists of the world to go to Bihać and ask the people who they believe should be sitting in jail, the Croatian generals or the UN officials. If there is true justice in the world, then one day we will be visiting a courtroom where the UN officials are on trial. It is time to judge the judges. Thank you, Jack Baric.